Amsterdam in the early 1980s was a city of contrasts. During the day, it shone with the elegance of its canals, the busy rhythm of bicycles, and the polished offices of powerful corporations. But under the surface, the city also carried whispers of crime, the murmur of discontent, and the dreams of men who wanted more than life had offered them. Among those men was Cor van Hout, a restless figure whose imagination rarely stopped at ordinary limits. On New Year's Eve of 1981, Cor sat in a modest room surrounded by his closest friends. The table was cluttered with ashtrays and empty glasses, and the smell of cheap beer lingered in the air. For most people, this was a time to make resolutions, to hope for luck in the coming year. But for Cor and his companions, the talk was darker. Money was short, debts were heavy, and their future seemed uncertain. Then Cor leaned forward and spoke of an idea that stunned the others. What if we take what we need? What if we go after someone so rich, so powerful, that one stroke could change our lives forever? At first, the words seemed like fantasy, but as the night wore on and the smoke thickened, the idea took root. By dawn, what had begun as speculation had hardened into a plan. They would not settle for small crimes. They would aim higher than anyone had dared before. Over the months that followed, the group of friends transformed into something more, a team with a mission. 5 men, bound by loyalty and ambition, began to weave the threads of a plan that would shock Europe. They studied targets, crossing names off their list, until only one remained: Freddy Heineken. He was not only one of the wealthiest men in the Netherlands, but also a symbol, the living face of an empire built on beer, wealth, and international prestige. To the kidnappers, he was the ultimate prize. Cor van Hout was the strategist, the one who never stopped thinking 2 steps ahead. Willem Holleder was charismatic but dangerous, a man who could charm and intimidate in the same breath. Jan Wellard was disciplined, almost military in his precision. Martin Erkamps, quieter than the rest, served as the steady hand. And Frans Meyer, impulsive yet inventive, brought both risk and creativity. Together, they formed a strange brotherhood, their fates tied to a single, audacious scheme. The planning consumed them. They rented warehouses under false names, purchased materials from Germany, and practiced the abduction until it became second nature. They tested how quickly a van door could slide open, how many seconds it would take to push a man inside, how fast they could vanish into side streets. Even the smallest detail mattered: how to burn clothing without leaving traces, how to silence captives without leaving bruises, how to build cells that could hold a man for weeks. By 1983, their plan was ready. The city that had once been merely home now looked to them like a chessboard, every street and corner mapped out, every possibility considered. They rehearsed their escape routes at night, sometimes tampering with traffic lights to learn how to control the rhythm of the city. They believed themselves unstoppable. On November 9th, 1983, as twilight fell, Freddy Heineken left his office. He was tired, but in good spirits, thinking of dinner and perhaps a quiet evening. His chauffeur walked beside him, a familiar figure, loyal and trusted. The street seemed ordinary, filled with the hum of traffic and the glow of street lamps reflecting on wet pavement. But from the shadows came a van. It screeched to a halt, and the door slid open with a metallic crash. Within seconds, masked men swarmed. Heineken had no chance to resist. His chauffeur shouted, but was silenced. Both were forced inside. The door slammed shut, and the van sped away. Pedestrians froze in shock, but by the time anyone realized what had happened, the kidnappers were gone. The abduction lasted 35 minutes from start to finish. To the kidnappers, it was the culmination of 2 years of obsession. To Amsterdam, it was the beginning of chaos. Just 90 minutes later, the police received the first message. A letter, typed and cold, demanded millions in ransom. The money had to be in small notes, divided carefully, with strict instructions on how it would be delivered. There was no room for negotiation. 72 hours, that was all the time the authorities had to comply. Meanwhile, Heineken and his chauffeur found themselves inside a steel warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The kidnappers had transformed it into a fortress of captivity. 2 narrow cells awaited, built from heavy metal and lined with soundproofing. The walls swallowed every sound, turning even a scream into silence. There was no daylight, only a dim electric bulb that cast shadows against the steel. For Heineken, the reality struck slowly. At first, he could not believe what had happened. How could a man of his power, his wealth, be dragged into such a nightmare? But as the hours turned into days, the truth settled over him. He was no longer a titan of industry, but a prisoner in a box, reduced to waiting on the whims of men who saw him no more than a payday. The kidnappers, meanwhile, congratulated themselves. Phase 1, the capture, had been flawless. Now Phase 2 began, negotiation. They used recordings of the chauffeur's voice to send proof of life, their words sharp and threatening. Every message was designed to create fear, to push the police toward obedience. They were convinced they had thought of everything. Yet behind their confidence, cracks began to show. Franz Meyer grew restless, pacing the warehouse at night. Martin Erkamps worried about the police, convinced they were being tracked. Even Kor, usually calm, felt the weight of what they had done. To kidnap a man like Heineken was not just a crime, it was a declaration of war against the establishment. And wars, they knew, were rarely won without losses. The days that followed became a tense dance between kidnappers and police. The criminals calculated every step. They weighed sacks of money, discovering that no more than 5 could be carried without slowing down. They argued over how the ransom should be delivered. Some wanted a dramatic handover by boat. Others preferred a simple system of cars and signals. In the end, they agreed on a series of complex instructions meant to confuse and control the authorities. On November 15th, the kidnappers made their first phone call. Their voices were calm but merciless. The police were ordered to mark a van and obey every command. One mistake, the kidnappers warned, and the hostages will die. Yet the police, unwilling to be manipulated, made errors. They hesitated, ignored instructions, and tried to gain the upper hand. This infuriated the kidnappers. Their next call was angrier, louder, filled with threats that chilled the officers who listened. Inside the steel warehouse, Heineken felt time crawl. Deprived of sunlight, he lost track of hours. He thought of his family, of his company, of the life he might never see again. At moments, he imagined conversations with his captors. At others, he planned how he might survive if abandoned. For a man who once commanded boardrooms, the silence of captivity was the hardest punishment of all. 10 days passed before the kidnappers changed tactics. A new message ordered police to retrieve a package from a storage locker. Inside were more instructions, each one designed to test obedience. The psychological battle deepened. The kidnappers wanted to remind the world that they controlled not only 2 lives, but the rhythm of the entire investigation. Finally, the ransom was delivered. The police, tense and sweating, followed the exact route given. The money was dropped. Out of the shadows, the kidnappers appeared. With astonishing